instance, they built it with all the nice AJAX functionality. They didn't build it accessibly, so they ended up having to go back and rework the entire code base in order to make it actually usable by somebody who didn't use a mouse or they used a screen reader. And we'll kind of talk a little bit about what the hang-ups are that cause issues for people as this presentation continues. But there's kind of, and this is something that we used to have back in the early days of the web as well, there's a whole, like, you must be this high to ride sort of paradigm going on. You know, is this site viewed best in Internet Explorer 6 or Netscape or what have you, which you still see online. If you do a search for this site best viewed in, there are just hundreds and hundreds of thousands of pages on Google for that sort of thing. And we don't want to be creating those sorts of barriers for people. I usually pick on some websites. I'm not going to do that today, but I can certainly mention a few that are pretty horrible. Accessibility is a really crucial thing. I love the ramp that we have outside the Country Museum. It's really beautiful, but God, could you imagine trying to get up that in a wheelchair? I mean, in a rascal, it would probably be pretty easy, but yeah, there are some things that seem like they're a good idea, but don't necessarily end up working. We'll talk about some of the best practices today. People often talk about how Google is kind of the largest blind consumer of the web. Google doesn't care about your visuals. It doesn't care about your awesome JavaScript and how things are sliding in and out of focus and stuff like that. All it cares about is the content. And that's a really important thing that helps us keep in mind what screen readers are paying attention to, because it's essentially how Google sees the web. But accessibility isn't just about screen readers. For instance, what if you don't have a mouse? Or what if you can't use one because you don't have the motor skills to do so? That's something we need to consider. And as we move into the mobile web, where we start to deal with people who have macular degeneration and such, we start to see people using page zoom. And when they're using these sorts of technologies, if there's a change via AJAX of some content on that page and that's not what they're zoomed into, they have no idea that that's actually happened. So they have no knowledge, and screen readers won't say this part of the page updated unless we tell them that this part of the page is going to be updated and you need to pay attention to that. So that's another thing we need to kind of keep in mind. And we can build things better. So in order to do that, we start with a foundation of XHTML and solid semantics. Semantics are kind of key to accessibility on the web. They provide the meaning behind the content that we're putting out there. Now, the problem is that if you don't use the right semantic elements, you can end up actually muddling the content and making it harder to understand, harder to parse, and actually obscure the meaning. The second level is to add CSS. So you use that to add your design and to kind of improve the scannability of a page, to improve the hierarchy of different elements within the page, and to kind of give people a quick sense of being able to get through everything. But similarly, CSS can also be used to obscure content and to keep it from screen readers. Display none, visibility hidden. These actually prohibit the content from being readable by a screen reader or another type of assistive device. The third level is JavaScript, which we of course use for creating our rich interactions, our very cool whiz-bang effects. But similarly, if we don't use that correctly, it can cause problems, and it's not reliable 100% of the time. There are certain companies that turn off JavaScript at the firewall. They're not going to get your rich experience, so you need to make sure you take into account how they're going to be viewing it. People who are on a mobile device, let's say that's less powerful than an iPhone or a Pre or a Nexus 1 or something like that, those people are also potentially going to have JavaScript either disabled by default because the browser can't handle it, or they might have it turned off to reduce the amount of bandwidth that they're using in order to access your content. So they may have actually turned JavaScript off. And for years we've been telling people who are using assistive devices that they should turn JavaScript off because most people don't know how to use JavaScript properly and end up making the pages inaccessible in their implementation of JavaScript. So those people may still be turning off JavaScript. There are ways, as I'll talk about today, to make JavaScript accessible, but those people still may be turning off. And then this final layer that we have is WAI-ARIA. WAI-ARIA stands for Web Accessibility Initiative's Accessible Rich Internet Applications. And that's a spec that was developed at the W3C, created XHTML and CSS and HTML, etc. And it's maintained by them. And I believe it's in the final draft phase right now. I don't think it's actually become a full-on implementation, but I don't remember for certain. But it's essentially a way that we can improve the interface by adding additional levels of meaning to our pages and actually making our JavaScript accessible and making our applications accessible. And it tells us information about the interface, how we're going to interact with it, etc. And this kind of all dovetails with the concept of progressive enhancement, which is that as the browser's capabilities become more advanced, we provide a richer experience for the user. And this was something that I actually talked about at Barcamp here in Chattanooga a couple months ago, about 6 months ago. That's something that I like to talk a lot about, so if you grab me afterwards, we can talk a lot about kind of layering on stuff with progressive enhancement. But that's essentially what this stack is. With ARIA added on top, usually I talk about the first 3 layers. So ARIA is a relatively new tool. They've been working on it since I believe about 2005. But people are already starting to implement it. And it's essentially semantics plus. It gives a lot more information about the interface, about the sort of things we're trying to do with the page, how to use it, what things are acting as, that sort of stuff. And we'll kind of go through the various roles that are available. But the general idea is to map a lot of the concepts from the operating system to the web browser. So take all these things and kind of move them over and allow people to interact with web pages the same way they would interact on the application level within a particular OS. The one caveat is that it doesn't validate as HTML currently. You can use a custom DTD, and there are several of them out there that will allow you to support ARIA attributes, but the issue is that ARIA uses an additional set of attributes on your HTML elements, and those are not part of the HTML spec because the HTML spec was last updated in 1999. They do work well with HTML5 if you are working with HTML5, but for HTML4 and XHTML1, etc., they're not going to validate. But there are a couple of tools that you can use. You can read a little bit more about it at this URL, and these slides will be available so you'll be able to all these. And then there's Validator SAC, which is a version of the W3C's validator that you can run locally on a Mac, and you can import your own DTDs to that type of validation. So there's a DTD that you can use with Validator SAC to validate ARIA on top of HTML4 or XHTML.
Is it part of the HTML5 spec? Is that what you said?
I know the HTML spec isn't so much flux, like almost from a day-to-day basis, that I don't know if it's actually in the spec, but I believe that they are adding a lot of this stuff in there and trying to make it as, make them work together as well as possible. There are some overlapping semantics between HTML5 and some of the stuff that's being done with WAI-ARIA, but it is, they're making it so they're going to mesh well together. Good question. So, kind of the first component of the WAI-ARIA stuff is calling attention to important pieces of a page. And we can do that through different roles. So some of the structural roles, if we were looking at the DevChatt page, we've got the role of banner at the top. We have the role of main, or the main amount of content. And what this does with a WAI-ARIA enabled assistive technology, or with a browser such as Firefox that supports it natively, it gets rid of our need for skip to links. So skip to content and stuff like that, because users automatically have access to something that has the role of main, and they can skip over the navigation and such. Other ones, role of navigation. So now we can provide these additional semantic hooks, basically, to our web page. We also have things like articles, which you're probably familiar with if you've played at all with HTML5. There is a similar construct there called article. We had a list, but hopefully you're actually using ordered or unordered lists instead of actually saying that something is a role of list. But if you absolutely needed to, you could do that. One example might be if you wanted to create an inline list and didn't want to bother with actually using generated content to create the commas and the and stuff like that, to actually do like blue, green, red, and orange. You could actually do it as a span and do roll of list, and then put roll of list item around each of the items if you wanted to provide the semantics that way. But hopefully in terms of block level elements, you're actually using block level list items, or block level list types, list constructs like UL, OL, and then list items for the individuals. If we scroll down the page, we can also use roll of form if for some reason you're not actually using a form element. Complementary is for complementary content to the main content of the page. We also have, can't really see it, the logos are actually over here. We've got content info, which is essentially for your footer information, your copyright statement and such. And then we have another list over here with the list of sponsors. So maybe that is just literally links. Maybe it wasn't put into a list construct. Maybe it's on a paragraph. So maybe we'll use roll list there. Similarly for the Twitter feed, and then within the Twitter feed, list item for the individual items within there. So these are all ways that we can kind of provide these structural roles to a document to give it greater accessibility in WAI-ARIA. This is kind of an overview of the various options we have for structurally related WAI-ARIA roles. For general document structure, we have things like group, which is kind of handy. Document, which kind of seems redundant to me, but I guess they found some reason for doing that. Row and row header and such for tabular content that maybe isn't marked up in a table for some reason. Although obviously I think that would be better marked up in a table. Then we have landmark roles such as application, banner. These are kind of the broader scope roles that are available within a document. We then have the ability to actually describe something and explain what it is and how it works. So I like this because it's just kind of the fun Lego stuff you used to build when you were a kid that makes absolutely no sense except in your mind. But sometimes we need to describe that stuff to people. So in terms of widget roles, we could actually say, okay, this span that maybe I'm doing something with JavaScript on, we can actually say it's operating as a button. We can do that by saying span role equals button. Of course, I think you should be using the button element, but if you have a good reason for using the span, this would be a good way to make it more accessible. Similarly, the role of alert is going to provide alerting information for a user. Combine those with the alert dialog. So this is an alert that's operating as a dialog box, perhaps overlaying the page. And then you have an image that's going to be your dismissing of that particular dialog. And we can give that a role of button. And then that's going to be clickable by the user. Yeah.
Is the role accessible via CSS, or are you still using an ID in class for the CSS display part of it?
If you use attribute selection, for the podcast, that was a question of whether you could use the attribute, or whether this was accessible via the role, and the answer is you can use the attribute selection, so the square bracket syntax, role equals, and then you'll be able to use that to access it via CSS. And that'll work in IE7 and above, pretty much every other browser that's got any sort of market share at this point. IE6, yes. Well, it will work if you use Extender, which is another thing I developed, but then it'll work in IE6 and IE55 and IE5 as well. So, so here's some other examples of widget roles. We have things like marquees, progress bar, so being able to indicate how a user is progressing through something. Radio group, these would be if you're creating JavaScript-based radios or checkboxes, etc. Again, I personally would prefer to see you actually using the semantic markup to create that, but these are ways that you can provide that additional information. Timers, text boxes, tabs, and tab panel, which we'll actually get into at the end of this presentation. Then there are various container roles as well, such as tree. so being able to create tree-based menus, that's all made accessible via WAI-ARIA as well. So lots of different options for you in terms of making accessible widgets. And then there are various properties for those widgets that we can use to describe kind of what's going on to the user. Some examples are read-only, be a way of letting the assistive technology know that that's a read-only field, when perhaps we're not using the read-only attribute. Value max and value min are useful in terms of a slider widget, which we'll actually show a brief example in a few minutes. If you're not using the label element, you can use label, labeled by, which I believe we'll actually show in a few minutes. There's the inverse of labeled by, which is described by, so that you can create that reverse relationship between something that's a label or a larger piece of content, which when we get to the tab interface, we'll look at that. Active descendant is an ID reference to the element within the containing element that has this attribute assigned to it that is active. So we provide all sorts of additional information for the user. So we can also use WAI-ARIA to indicate what's going on to the user. And we do this via widget states. So if, for instance, we have two versions of a button, let's say this is on a WYSIWYG tool that we're using within the browser, we have an off state and an on state. Now, in terms of the markup, that may simply be a difference of bold-off and bold-on as the PNG that's being used for that particular button. But that doesn't provide any accessible information about that particular button and the state of that button, because we only have an alt text of bold. We could improve that by saying when it's bold off, it's not bold. But using WAI-ARIA, we can actually make it even more kind of obvious as to what's going on. We can say this button has a role of button and ARIA pressed equals false. So there's a little redundancy here between the button and role button. And the reason I've got that in there is that some assistive technologies kind of require the role button trigger in order to let them know that they should look for things like ARIA pressed. So to be on the safe side, this would be a good practice to follow. But then when bold is on, we can say ARIA pressed true. So the user, when they focus on that button, they can be given the feedback that particular button is currently engaged. Right? Does that make sense? Really straightforward stuff. So more complex widget here. This is a slider, obviously, but this is a more complex slider because it's a date range slider. We actually have a start and an end. And this is a jQuery UI widget, I believe now, that was developed by Filament Group up in Boston, who do some great progressive enhancement work, and they've been starting to integrate WAI-ARIA stuff into there. But the default view of this, without JavaScript running, is 2 select boxes, which is awesome. So it actually works if you don't have JavaScript at all, and then if you do have JavaScript, it layers on this additional kind of UI feature and allows you to select via a slider. But some of the roles that they're using in states, they have role of application around the whole thing. Then we have a role of slider on one of the slider handles, and it has a labeled by that tells you what the element, this is an ID reference. So it's the ID to this element right here. This is April 04. We have a value min of 0, value max of 71, value now of 22. The value text is April 04. So we're providing all sorts of additional information for users about what the state of this particular slider is at this point in time. And that gets updated as the sliders move. We also have presentation, which is kind of showing the date format, and within that he has several definition lists which define the years and then the month ranges within the years, etc. Some of the widget states that we have available to us are busy, checked, invalid, pressed, grab, for drag and drop type stuff. You can make drag and drop accessible with WAI-ARIA, which is pretty awesome. Value now and value text are technically properties, but to me they're really a state thing, so I don't see why they're really filed under properties. Because they're something that's going to be changing over time, so that seems state thing and a property thing to me, which is why I put them over here. Any questions on this so far? So another piece is letting users know. We talked a little bit about how a user, if they're zoomed in, for instance, may not see content that's updated on page elsewhere, outside of their view. So we want to be able to show that to people. And we can do that using live regions. So most of you are probably familiar with the Twitter update box. And up here we have the character count of how many characters are left within your tweet. So this is the current markup that they have. They've got a span with strong inside of it, strongly emphasizing 140. If we were to use ARIA Live Polite, we can politely update the user as to what that character count is every time it changes. Okay, so anytime this particular element has a change made within it, the user will be updated. Now personally, I would take it a step further and actually say 140 characters left, so that there's some context to that number being read out to a user. But that's me. The various notification options that you have are off, or it won't announce anything, which is pretty much the default. Polite, assertive, which is going to actually interrupt a user, but it's kind of an odd definition. It interrupts you, but not immediately. And then there's rude, which immediately interrupts whatever you're doing to announce what's going on.
Passive aggressive.
Yeah, kind of. I mean, what I imagine is that the assertive probably waits till it finishes reading whatever it is that you're currently having read to you, and then it would assert itself, basically. But those are the different options we have in terms of live content. So the other piece that kind of goes into this is the keyboard accessibility, because not all users use a mouse, and those who are extremely proficient at computers don't use mice as well. So it's not just people who have motor disabilities. So we can use sleight of hand with tab index to enable certain elements to be focused, and to allow them to be focused by the browser or only by JavaScript. So if we use a tab index of 0, what happens in terms of the browser is that the user is able to tab to that element in the order that it is shown in the document. So just like they would normally be able to tab to something, but it actually makes something capable of being tabbed to. So in this case, a div is not typically capable of being tabbed to. So by applying a tab index of 0, we can actually use the tab key to access that div. Okay? Using a tab index of -1 allows us to use focus as a JavaScript method on a particular element to move focus to that element. So it doesn't make it accessible via the tab key, but it makes it available to us in JavaScript for applying focus to that particular element. Any questions on that? We'll show it on an example, actually in 1 minute. So how do we put this stuff all together? We'll start with a tab interface here, which, how many of you were in my bar camp presentation? Thanks, Stephen and Josiah. So I went through kind of how to build this. So this will be a little recap on how the underlying thing is built, but I'm going to take it from the ground up, basically. And then we'll apply some of the WAI-ARIA stuff to it. So the traditional approach for building a tab interface would be to have some sort of containing element, and then within that we have these divs that are classified as maybe a section or something like that. And then we'd have an unordered list at the end that's your tabs that link then to the various content blocks within it. And often you'd see them with octothorpe or hashes within the href attribute, which means that that link is unusable by anybody that doesn't have JavaScript because it's not going anywhere. It's an anchor reference to nothing. So this isn't a particularly good way to do things, but this is the way things have been traditionally done for years. But if we start with just basically the markup, right? We have pumpkin pie as our heading 1. We've got overview as a heading 2, ingredients as a heading 2. We've got some paragraphs, etc. This would be our baseline of support. If somebody did not have JavaScript available to them, this works well. Okay? wanted to, we could apply a little bit of typography style to it to make it a little bit more attractive. So if somebody had some basic CSS support, we could provide this option to them. We could add a little bit of color to it, in this case just turning the border bold. But again, kind of applying CSS in layers, progressively enhancing the interface based on what a user has in terms of their system's capabilities. If we went back and looked at the markup again, you'll remember that we had heading levels, right? So heading levels, if you've ever kind of thought about it, or you've ever viewed a web page in outline mode, which is available via the web developer toolbar in Firefox, you'll know that heading levels create an outline for a document. So you have your H1s, and then nested within the H1s are the H2s, nested within those H2s or H3s, et cetera, et cetera. So those provide some structure to the document. So using JavaScript, we could go through the document and see where those heading levels are, and then actually break up the content when the page loads, and then build the tab interface from that, because we want to make each of these into a tab. So using JavaScript, we can do that fairly easily. All we have to do is kind of make a classification of the container to be tabbed. So in this case, div class of tab is all the change to markup that we need to do in order to kind of facilitate JavaScript taking over and building the tab interface for us. Does that make sense so far? Not technical people following along too. So in terms of what the flow is for us, we've got the page loads, and if JavaScript is not available, it's just the page, and they get whatever level of CSS support they can handle. If JavaScript is available, we're going to split the content based on those heading levels and build the whole tab interface. So we can build those containing divs for each of the sections. We can build that list of the links dynamically and insert that into the DOM, because JavaScript is great at updating the DOM. So we end up with something that works like this. And in order to accessibly hide the content of the tabs when they're not visible, or the tab panels when they're not visible, we're actually using position absolute and using a left value of -999 EMs. So 999 EM widths to the left, so it gets shunted way out of the user's view, but that's still an accessible way to actually view that, or to have that content read to you.
Why not use display none?
Display none does not get read by a screen reader, so if for some reason they didn't have WAI-ARIA support, and we didn't put keyboard accessibility in, they wouldn't have access to that content at all.
Because your -999 always shows up on my monitor number 1 way over here. And I'm like, oh.
Do you have your...
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Man,
When a website is centered, I imagine, right?
right.
If it's a left aligned website and it's left -999, it shouldn't show, because you wouldn't be able to go wide enough, because it's always
3,000 pixels across.
right. So a centered website,
Yeah.
it wouldn't be a left aligned website. So I mean, it depends on your considerations for.
I didn't know display none didn't get read, so that's.
Yeah, display none doesn't get read. Same with visibility hidden.
Okay.
And visibility hidden still takes up room in terms of the flow of the document, so it's not good as well. Using ARIA, there is an ARIA attribute called hidden, which you can set to true or false, which is nice as well, which we'll see in a minute. But this is the basic level of interactivity in terms of progressively enhancing this particular interface. So now in terms of ARIA, we can go through and assign some roles. We have our role of application. And in this particular view of the tab interface, we have an ARIA active descendant of folder-1. This is an ID reference to the div that's surrounding this first bit of content. We're using a folder and tab metaphor. So this is the content of tab 1 is folder 1, tab 2 is folder 2, et cetera, et cetera. And these are actually ID'd as folder-1 tab, folder-2 tab, et cetera, so that we have some correspondence between them in terms of the underlying JavaScript, which you'll kind of see borne out as we go through the ARIA rules and stuff. So we have folder-1-tab. So that corresponds to that. Makes sense so far? Okay, we then have a role of tab list on the unordered list that contains these list items. And then the nutrition tab, for instance, would have a role of tab. ARIA is selected false because it's not currently the selected tab. And then it would be described by folder-4. Overview, on the other hand, still a role of tab. ARIA selected is true, and it is associated with folder 1. Okay. Does this make sense to everybody in terms of the roles and such that we've applied? All right, so now we'll walk through actually how to do this stuff within the JavaScript. And this is an open source, freely available on GitHub script, so that if you want to go through and kind of see how the rest of the script functions, you can do that. I figured it would be a little bit exhaustive and possibly over the head of some folks if I did the whole thing during this thing. So just going through the highlights of the WAI-ARIA stuff here. So we have a function, a method on this particular object called swap, which is going to handle swapping out which is the visible tab in a tab panel. So within that, we've identified the old tab as old_tab, and then we're going to set the ARIA selected attribute to false. We've identified the current tab, and we're going to set it to ARIA selected true. The old folder is getting ARIA hidden true, and the new folder is getting ARIA hidden false. So in other words, we're swapping which tab panel and tab are activated. Okay. And then the cabinet itself, which is the container for the various folders and tabs, we're setting the active descendant to be this is an ID reference to the _active. It's an ID reference to the currently active tab, which would be the new folder. So the folder 1, folder 4, whatever it is. Making sense so far? So then for the keyboard, to make this now keyboard accessible, which we know we use as tab index and such, we're going to create a new method called moveFocus, and we're going to trigger that on key down when you're focused on a tab. So when the tab is the current object, we're going to listen for a keystroke event and use that to move focus. And then on focus, so if we send focus via JavaScript, we want to trigger swap automatically. So we're not having to run that same function again. We just tie it like this, and we don't have to worry about calling that particular method over and over again. As soon as it's focused, it'll automatically trigger it. So going back to our view of it, we would have nutrition with a tab index of 1, so it is focusable by JavaScript, but it's not focusable by a user tabbing through the document. Overview, however, we give a tab index of 0 because it's the currently available one, so we want to allow someone to focus to that. And what will happen is when we allow a user to focus into the currently active tab, we can allow them to move using their up or down arrows, home, end, whatever, allow them to move back and forth through the tab list. And we'll use JavaScript to trigger the switching of the tab that the user is currently focused on. We'll see how that works in a minute. So in order to do that, we create a method called moveFocus. It captures the event, and then what's going to happen is, because we don't want to capture all keyboard events because the user might be triggering something else going on, so we only want to capture certain ones. The thing to kind of point out here is pass equals true, and then what that is to kind of identify keystroke events that we want to pass on, we want to allow to bubble up and continue being listened for within the document. So if we don't want it to pass, we want to return cancel that particular event, and then there's a cancel function which will go ahead and take care of the event propagation such. The other little bit, there's a get tab method here, which I'll actually show you, which goes ahead and it looks to see what a user has focused on, and if for some reason it's another element within the tab, it'll go ahead and move up until it gets to the tab, and then it'll assign that as the actual tab. So if you had a span inside of the list item for some reason, that will be accounted for, and it'll keep building up until it gets to the list item. That's what it'll use for the tab. So then, just kind of a compressed view of the keyboard events that we're going to listen for. before, inside of move focus, we switch based on the key that the user clicked. 37 and 38 are the left and up arrows respectively. And then we're going to call this function called move. We're going to pass it the current tab. We want it to move to the previous tab, and we don't want it to move all the way. The third argument on that particular method that I've created allows you to move all the way to the beginning or end of the list for the home and end keys. And then the other one I'm going to show you here is the escape key, which is 27. In that case, we want to blur the tab, so we can call it tab blur. And then we don't want to pass that. So. And then within the actual move function, as I said, it takes 3 arguments: the tab, the direction you want to move, and whether you want to move completely to the start or the end. If complete, then it goes ahead and chooses, if it's the previous direction, it's going to move to the child node 0. So this is the tab itself, which is a list item, to the list, and then it's going to go to the first child item, which is going to be the first list item, and I'll focus that one. Otherwise, it'll go to the end, which is the length of the child nodes minus 1. So it'll focus on the last item in the list. That's all that does. And then otherwise, it'll check the direction, and then it'll move to the previous or next sibling and focus on that particular element if it exists. If for some reason you were to click the right arrow or the down arrow on the last item, obviously that next sibling would not exist, so it doesn't try to focus it. But that's how this keyboard stuff works. And then once we've done kind of this swapping stuff, because as you remember, whenever we focus on one of those tabs, it's going to trigger the swap function. So if we move to the swap, after we set the ARIA selected to false, we'll also set its tab index to -1 so that it's no longer accessible via a user tabbing through the document. And we'll update the tab index of the current tab to being 0 so that that's the one that a user can focus to if they were to move their focus via the tab elsewhere. And then similarly, we can remove the old folder from the tab index and add the current folder to the tab index. All that makes sense? Who's overwhelmed? So let's see if the audio will actually work here. Not quite super loud, but essentially what it's doing is it's actually reading out the tabs as you move through them, and then it's reading out the content of those tabs. So we've created a bridge in an application, essentially. So who's supporting WAI-ARIA? All of these companies. All of the newer versions of browsers are supporting WAI-ARIA in some respect. IBM has put a lot of effort behind this, especially their work with Dojo, on a lot of the digit widgets that are part of the Dojo stuff. Adobe is starting to work a lot with this. Yahoo has really been embracing a lot of the WAI-ARIA stuff and progressive enhancement on the whole. Google's starting to do a bit of it. Some of the jQuery UI widgets are starting to be WAI-ARIA based. And then we're starting to see some of the assistive technologies, WindowEyes, JAWS, Orca, and NVDA is a free one that's available for Windows, which is where the audio you may or may not have heard came from. But they're actually doing really good WAI-ARIA support, and perhaps one of the best, and it works really well with Firefox if that's your browser of choice. Unfortunately, Windows only at this point. On the Mac end, we really don't have a good screen reader for WAI-ARIA quite yet, even though some are already starting to expose this stuff. So to read a little bit more, a couple of links up here. The tab interface itself is available on GitHub, so you can look at that and play around with it and kind of see how it works. And then all of this stuff, all the slides will be available on SlideShare a little bit later today. I put up and such. Thank you all very much. If you have questions, please feel free to ask. And if you ask good questions, I've got some books to give away.